When I was here in January, we talked about working memory as the first step along the journey from the outside world into long-term memory. And in particular, we talked about 3 key pieces about working memory. The first is it's crucial to learning. What happens in working memory is that information from the outside world comes in. I described it as a singles bar, you may remember. So information comes in from the outside world into the singles bar of working memory, and it meets up with information from long-term memory, and perhaps it will form a new and enduring connection. Learning happens in working memory. The second key thing to know about it is it's really small. Alphabetizing 5 presidents, check. Alphabetizing 10 states, what does it the kids say? Epic fail. And the third sad piece is there's really nothing we can do to expand it. It grows naturally up through adolescence, but once you've hit about 18, we're kind of done. And there's nothing external that we can do to expand it. So as we teach, we need to think about all of these truths about working memory. And we spent much of our time in January going over this chart. First of all, thinking about what it is that we can do to spot places where we might be overwhelming working memory capacity. And once we've identified those, we talked about several strategies here that you could use for avoiding those problems. Today we're going to pick up sort of mid-sentence where we left off, thinking about the formation of long-term memory. And long-term memory not as a place. It's not a bookshelf that if you can get information from through working memory, you can put it on the shelf of long-term memory. Long-term memory is itself a process. And the more we understand about the process of long-term memory formation, the more effective we can be at creating long-term memories. I want to start by inviting you to set aside scientific terminology and just sort of think for a minute about what you already think about the process of long-term memory formation. And probably thinking metaphorically is the easiest way to do it. What's memory like? When you put something in memory, what do you think that's like when you get it back out of memory? What's that like? So just take a couple of seconds to think about it. If I needed a memory for metaphor, I would say memory is like a Okay, so what memory metaphors do you have floating around out there? Memory is like a? Yes? Memory is like a camera. Say more about that?
It's like you have these snapshots in your camera.
Great. Memory is like taking a picture with the camera. Yeah.
Memory is like taking a picture with the camera, but then you always look prettier when you look back at it later.
I like this camera. Very good. Yes?
Memory is like a closet. So you can store things in there and pull them out as you wish, and sometimes things get buried back in the corner of the closet and you forget about them.
Okay. So as we're talking this morning about the process of long-term memory formation, have these different metaphors for that process in mind. Maybe it's like a camera, maybe it's like a camera that makes you pretty. I want one of those cameras. Is it a closet? Is it an attic? People often say a filing cabinet. So have in mind different potential metaphors for the way the process of long-term memory formation works. So I want to give you an overview of different structures of the brain, just to sort of locate you. So this is what the brain looks like from the outside. I just pried off the outside of my skull, and I'm looking here at the left side of the brain as if this part of the skull was just taken off. All of the brains that I show you this morning are going to be oriented the same way, so unless I tell you, it's going to be on this orientation. Typically, we talk about the brain, the surface of the brain, having 4 sections. And when I started studying the brain, really the only thing I knew about the brain was the location of the cerebral cortex. It has the word core in it. It's at the center of the brain. So happily, it turns out the only thing that I knew about the brain was wrong. The word cortex in Latin means bark. So the cerebral cortex is the outer coating of the brain. So typically, the outer surface is discussed in having 4 parts or 4 lobes. 2 of these names are easy to remember, 2 of them are hard to remember. So the frontal lobe is easy to remember. It's in front. It's right here. The frontal lobe does planning of motion, and then all of what we would think of as higher level cognitive functions. Planning takes place in the frontal lobe. Self-control takes place in the frontal lobe. Working memory substantially takes place in the frontal lobe. So higher order thinking, front part of the frontal lobe. The part of the brain, the green part there, which is behind your temple, is easy to remember. It's called the temporal lobe. It's close to your ear, so it makes sense. It manages hearing functions. And hearing and language go together, so it makes sense that two of the major areas that process language are in or next to the temporal lobe. In the back of the brain, the blue area there, actually I was talking, who was it who conked your head? I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Bill. Conked his head and banged his occipital lobe pretty hard over break. So the occipital lobe, this is the hardest name to remember. It's in blue and it processes vision. It's the one lobe of the brain that's devoted pretty much to one function. The occipital lobe processes vision. And then the gold part up top there is called the parietal lobe. At Loomis, the rules we had about keeping boys and girls apart were called parietal rules. Is that what you call them here? Okay. I think parietal comes from a Latin word that means walls, the thing that keeps it apart. So the parietal lobe is keeping the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe away from each other so nothing naughty happens. That's how I try and remember parietal. The parietal lobe manages bodily sensation. Everything that you feel either on the exterior or interior of your body, you're feeling because the parietal lobe is managing that for you. It does many other things as well, but that's the easiest one to think of. If we then take off, you know the brain is in two hemispheres, so I'm going to take off this hemisphere, and now you're going to be looking at the inside of the other hemisphere, and there's still cortical material there as well. In particular, this area right in the middle, that purple part, apparently somebody somewhere thinks that looks like a belt, so they call it the cingulate cortex, cingulate having to do with belts. And in just a little while, we're going to be talking about the back part of the cingulate cortex. But this is neuroanatomy, people. We can't say the back part of. We need a fancy name for it. So let's call it the posterior cingulate cortex. Doesn't that sound much fancier? Don't you feel more elevated and like you got to use your Latin? So, posterior cingulate cortex. So the cortex is about 6 cells thick. It's, by the way, the biggest brain difference between humans and all other animals. We have much more cortex. That's why we have human brains. If you take off the cortex and look underneath, the brain is more organized into specific structures, into particular areas with different kinds of neurons in them. And I want to show 3 of those to you. The first is going to be right up here underneath the front of the cingulate cortex. And it's called the nucleus accumbens. I don't have a good mnemonic for nucleus accumbens. To me, it sounds a little bit like nuclear submarine. And it's responsible for the reward network in the brain. So I think, ooh, I got a present. I get a nuclear submarine. So reward nucleus accumbens. That's the best I got for a mnemonic for that. Quite small, very powerful. And then we're going to zoom back to the outside of the brain. I'm going to take off the cortex from the temporal lobe right there. And underneath the cortex in the temporal lobe are 2 crucial structures that teachers hang out with all the time. The first, apparently, in neuroanatomy, looks like a seahorse. So it's called the hippocampus, because that's Latin for seahorse. The hippocampus manages memory functions. Declarative memory functions are largely managed by the hippocampus. Teachers love the hippocampus. If you didn't have a hippocampus, you'd be that guy who's based on a real person. In Memento, his hippocampus was damaged. He wasn't able to form new declarative memories. That's what happens in the hippocampus. So we love ourselves some hippocampus. And right at the tip of the hippocampus is another area called the amygdala, which I'm guessing many of you have heard of. The amygdala manages fear and emotional responses to fear and memories of fear.
Because amygdala is in Spanish.
Yeah.
Maybe tonsils.
Really?
It's the same word with an I instead of a Y.
Amygdala means tonsil. So you can remember it because you're scared to have your tonsils taken out. That's really helpful. It must mean Latin teachers. Does amygdala mean small?
It sounds Greek, and I'm not sure what it is.
Okay. It's Greek to all of us then. Okay.
We're the Greeks, especially.
Okay. All right. So what then are the teaching implications of understanding a little bit